Hello everybody, Neon here from Artifact Academy. I wanted to do a video today talking about the article that dropped on the website today, talking about gaming according to Garfield, or Dr. Garfield's approach to game design and game theory. So there's an article, of course, linked in the description if you want to go through that and see all the details in there. Go for it, but I wanted to give a summary of this in a video format for those who are interested in that. So as everybody here should know, Richard Garfield is one of the lead designers on Artifact, which is really exciting since he's the father of the trading card game, he's the creator of Magic, and he's been involved in creating a lot of other trading card games or games in general over the last 25 years. So it was really exciting to hear that he was going to be part of the project. But when I heard this, I started to think, I don't really know what Dr. Garfield's thinking is about game design. Like, what's his philosophy on the subject? I know that he had written a lot and spoken a lot on the subject over the course of this time, but I thought it would be useful to study this and then communicate something to the community because I thought it was a really interesting subject. So before we get into that, I actually want to spend a little bit of time talking about why is it important to study game design, why game design matters as gamers. Because I don't think this is true of most different types of media appreciation. So if you're a moviegoer or audio listener, if you like music, you like books, I don't think it's really necessary for you to enjoy film theory or know anything about music theory or literary theory in order to get a lot out of your genre of choice. One of the great things about great works of media is that great works of art is that you don't really need to know why you enjoy them in order to enjoy them. You just do. Things change a little bit for gamers. Obviously, you can still enjoy games without knowing a lot about game theory. There's like tons of people, and the average gamer still doesn't know anything about it. But one of the things changes that if you're trying to win, if you're trying to maximize your chances of progressing, I actually think it's quite useful to understand the rules, mechanics, and theory behind why the game works the way that it does. Now, once again, this really only applies to people who are trying to be competitive. If you're casual and just kind of want to mess around and have fun, go have at it. Just do what you like. Gaming is there to enjoy, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're really trying to maximize your chances of win, I think that it's quite useful to understand sort of how games work more fundamentally. And this is particularly true of card games. One of the things that's an interesting facet of card games is that when you're talking about deck design, it's sort of asking you to think like a game designer in some capacities. So there's actually a whole kind of complex reasons as to why the history of game design and history of card game theory has involved a lot of overlap with thinking about game design. I'm not going to get into that here, but I just think that the genre itself is particularly well designed in order to encourage you to think in this way. With that, let's do a few disclaimers before getting into the meat of the subject. So, first off, I want to make totally clear that this is not an official summary in any capacity. This hasn't been authorized by Dr. Garfield. I haven't had direct contact with Dr. Garfield, so don't take anything as I say as some sort of gospel. Also, this is just a summary. Dr. Garfield has been thinking and talking and writing about gaming for almost 30 years now, and I'm not going to be able to capture everything in a video like this or in an article like the one that I wrote. Also, I'm going to be focusing on generalities here. There's going to be exceptions to a lot of the rules that I'm talking about. But there's obviously a lot of great games out there that break, quote unquote, some of the rules of conventional game design. So if I get people who are in the comments talking about it, like, oh, this game doesn't follow that rule, they're totally wrong. I'm just going to respond with trick emotes like Failfish and Swift Rage or something like that. I haven't decided though. It could be some other ones. But anyway, I also want to stress that most of this just applies to ortho games. This is a term that Dr. Garfield uses in a lot of his writing, and it's a game that's between two or more people with defined winners and losers and with a defined endpoint. This is opposed to games like cooperative games where everybody's sort of working together, or games which don't have a fixed endpoint like Dungeons and Dragons or World of Warcraft, etc. Some of this stuff doesn't apply there, but you'll find that some of it also still applies to those kinds of games as well. Next, these topics are not going to be fully separated. There's going to be a little bit of overlap here and there, as you can expect with any complex topic like this. And then I'm also not going to be prefacing everything with Dr. Garfield thinks, where I think that Dr. Garfield thinks. This kind of gets obnoxious. I'm going to do my best to make clear when I am putting in my own thoughts or my own predictions based on things. I'm going to be talking a lot through this about how does this apply to Artifact and what might we expect to see in Artifact. As like those are all my own thoughts. For most of the things that I'm not saying that, I'm actually just going to be trying to give a summary of what I think Dr. Garfield thinks. And just there's a lot of links that I've used, a lot of sources that I've used. They're all linked below. There's a whole whack of links down there, some interesting related material as well. And of course, a link to the original article, so you can check that out as well. But let's move into things. What does Dr. Garfield think about game design? And we're going to start with balance, collapse, and rock, paper, scissors. So balance is a topic that everybody, of course, has been exposed to when thinking about games. You want to have a variety of strategies that are equally viable or similarly viable, so that they're in balance with one another. Now, this is challenging actually to do in practicality, because it's pretty easy to have one strategy be overpowered relative to another one and then pushes out other strategies from the environment, and ultimately you're left with a world in which although there were apparently a bunch of different strategies, only one of them is actually viable because it's just the best one. And this is what's known as strategic collapse, which is a situation that you want to avoid in your games. One of the easiest ways to avoid this is actually to use some version of rock, paper, scissors balancing. So everybody, of course, knows the simple game where one thing beats another thing, and that they're all linked together in a circle. There's not one that's strictly better than the others. And although this isn't usually applied in such a cut and dry way in conventional games, you can see that it's that there are a lot of games that use elements of a rock, paper, scissors balancing system. So in card games, you'll see that aggro decks are often beaten by mid-range decks, but then those mid-range decks can be beaten by control decks, and those control decks are beaten by the aggro decks. And that's a sort of a truism that a lot of people will be familiar with. And then also you in RTS style games, you'll see melee units will be weak to flying units, which will be weak to range units, and those range units will be weak to the melee units. This is all different styles of rock, paper, scissors balancing. This means that none of these strategies, none of these units are going to be strictly better or dominant over any of the others, because there's always going to be a natural counter to them in practice. Wait a minute, Dion. Isn't rock, paper, scissors just like a terrible game? Isn't it just a game of chance? Why would we want our competitive games to be styled after rock, paper, scissors? That's a pretty natural response, but I think it's a little bit short-sighted. So, for instance, it's not necessary that all of the matchups has to be strictly better than like scissors always beats paper, but there's no reason that has to be the case for our games when we're using rock, paper, scissors style balancing. So let's take a look at some example metagames that we could see in Artifact, that some examples of good and bad rock, paper, scissors balancing. So here's an example. First, we see red has a 90% win rate over black decks. Black has a 90% win rate over mono green decks, and green decks have a 90% win rate over red decks. And then blue's off to the side, having a 50% match against everything. This is, in my opinion, an example of bad rock, paper, scissors balancing, because everything's so coin flippy, so dramatic on one side. It's basically the only deck that you're going to be able to play that has particularly compelling matchups is the blue deck. Everything else is going to just feel like everything is just matchup dependent, and that feels really bad. Now compare this to this system here, where there's a lot more decks that are viable. So there's 6 as opposed to just 4, 50% increase. And we also see a range of different matchup values. There are some 65% matches, but those are rare. There's a lot of them that are closer to 50% or 55% as well. So that leads to a much more compelling and rich metagame. You could imagine that any of these decks that has any innovation that helps it do a little bit better against one of their bad matchups or one of their good matchups, and then everything can kind of move. So this is in my opinion, an example of what a good rock paper scissors style game would look like, because you still see that this is following the rock paper scissors methodology because of the interactions of something beating something else and losing to the other things. So what does this all imply for Artifact? I think that what we can say is that we should expect some amount of rock, paper, scissors style balancing. Obviously, it's difficult right now to guess exactly which strategies are going to be better than others, under which circumstances, but for example, we could expect that red decks are generally advantaged against blue decks, and blue decks are generally advantaged against green decks, et cetera, something like that. But the degree to which it's going to be following a strict rock, paper, scissors setup is probably not going to be close to 90% or 100%. It'll probably be more in the 55 to 65% range in that. So that's something that I think that you should expect. Another thing that I should mention is that Dr. Garfield, in one of his talks, described how metagames that are overly open and overly broad, having way too many different viable decks, are actually kind of bad, and that a lot of people don't like them as much as they think that they do. And he kind of suggested that between 4 and 8 decks is about the best in his opinion. Now, of the top competitive decks, what this means here is that I don't think that people should be expecting an infinitely diverse metagame for Artifact. I know a lot of people think that that's what they want, but in reality, maybe this isn't what's healthiest for the game. But we'll see how that plays out, and obviously the definition of what makes a competitive deck versus a fringe deck is up for debate, but just another comment that I found interesting from some of his content. So, next, let's talk about skill and balance. It's not just about the cards that you're playing a corresponding deck, it's also about the player that you are. This clearly matters a lot more in a lot of cases than just the cards that you have in front of you. There's one story that Garfield told in one of his talks about a game that he was balancing, in which one of the strategies that was available that was for free was perceived as being bad, but really it just was performing bad at low skill levels, but actually performed quite well at high skill levels. And this led to a bit of a weird effect within the community, where it was perceived as being a lot worse than it was, especially at the lower skill levels. This is something that I think we can actually pretty clearly imagine how it might apply to Artifact. I wouldn't be surprised if we see decks that are high skill cap decks that are perform pretty bad in low skill metagames and at the lower tiers, and then you do a lot better at the higher tiers. In fact, I think that it's worth emphasizing this is also something that Dota does and Valve does. If you look at heroes like Wraith King and Bounty Hunter in Dota 2, Wraith King is a hero that does it's very tanky. His game plan is largely just kind of getting up into people's faces and hitting them a lot. Just in the head, doesn't have a lot of active skills, and his ultimate ability is just that he gets resurrected when he dies and is on a cooldown. Doesn't need strategic activation or keen gameplay to get it off properly. So he's a fairly easy player a fairly easy hero to play. And you contrast this with something like Bounty Hunter, who's all about stealth and setting up these gank attacks, and it has a lot more necessary to work with his team. So this is a much higher skill cap hero, and you can see that in the win rates of these heroes if you look at the different skill categories that you can see in the games. There's a lot of great data about this on dotabuff.com. that you can see. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see styles of this balancing in Artifact as well, where there are some decks and some cards, some heroes that do well at different MMRs. Next, let's talk about Snowball and Catchup mechanics. If you haven't encountered this ideas, we can go through a couple of examples using the game Monopoly, which I'm sure almost everybody here has played. So the first example, we'll talk about somebody who gets the 3 orange properties first. He's the first person to assemble a set of 3 properties. So from here, they are able to buy up a bunch of houses. Then they go to hotels and they're able to make tons and tons of rent, and this causes what would be known as a snowball in the game, because it allows them to take their advantage advantage and catalyze this to a much larger and larger advantage. So that's a snowballing mechanic in a game. Now, another mechanic that is in Monopoly that a lot of people use is a house rule, but still almost is an official rule of the game, is that any money that is given to a community chest or chance goes into the center. This can build up to a pretty big wad of cash over the course of the game. And then if somebody lands on free parking, they get all this money. Now, this is a really useful catch-up mechanic, because what it means is that if you fall behind in the game and there's a big stack of cash sitting in the middle, then you say, like, oh man, if I get that, then maybe I can get back into the game. I can, buy something sweet and get back into this. So that's a really useful tool for the game and creates dynamic gameplay. Now, one of the things that's interesting in this is that in the textbook, Dr. Garfield spoke about the snowball and the catch-up mechanics, and he actually kind of described it as like this is a bit of an illusion in some respects, because people perceive the advantage climbing over time and growing over time, but in reality the advantage is sort of all accumulated at the beginning. If you take the example once again where somebody acquires all 3 of the orange properties, their net worth at the beginning of the game, as they acquire more and more rent, does go up slowly as they're getting people landing on their properties. But their chance to win, if you actually were to plot that over the course of the game, it actually just spikes as soon as they acquire these 3 properties. And I mean, of course, it would still increasing after this, every time somebody lands on one of their properties. But that specific event of acquiring the third of the set and being the first to acquire a set is really what propels them to move up in it, and it's less of a snowball and more just a spike. So what does this mean for Artifact? How could this apply to Artifact? Well, I wouldn't be surprised if we see some amount of snowball-y mechanics in the game. In some respects, you can almost imagine the current knowledge that we have about the lane setup, and that it could have a bit of a snowball-y appearance, since somebody who dominates a lane gets more gold, which is able to feed that into their heroes, getting better through weapons, and definitely builds a snowball-y feel to the game. Alternatively, you could imagine some catch-up mechanics, such as using powerful spells. Another possibility is actually using the shop, which obviously has some randomness to it, but we could even imagine things like what if the prices on the super special items from the store are somewhat randomized, so that you have a chance of picking up something really sweet at a discount price, which allows you to get back in the game when you were struggling earlier. Wait a minute, Neon. Once again, why are you advocating for this bad gameplay in our games? Like, isn't randomness and luck bad in games? Like, don't we want to avoid having randomness and luck in games? This idea of secret shop stuff is clearly terrible. Well, I have some things to say to you that you're going to have to get used to, because maybe luck isn't all that bad. And I think that Dr. Garfield would really disagree with you on that. So let's get to the next topic within Dr. Garfield's thinking. Luck and skill in games. There's a bit of an oversimplification that you'll see within people who talk about card games or games in general, that games of skill are good and games of luck are bad. And of course, chess, a classic game of skill, snakes and ladders, classic game of luck, and this is just the way things are distilled down, that there are good games and there are bad games, and some of them are luck based and some of them are skill based, so we always want more skill and less luck in our game. This is a bit of a false dichotomy, as you can see that especially in games like Texas Hold'em Poker. Poker is a game that is very high skill and very high luck in its own way. So where does that fit into things? Dr. Garfield feels that games actually more fall under a 2-axis continuum, where there are games that are high variance and low variance, games that are high skill and low skill. You can see here for different quadrants of different games that fall under the different sides. Tic-tac-toe is low skill, low variance. You have snakes and ladders, which is low skill, high variance. Poker is a high variance, high skill, and chess is, of course, low variance, high skill. Artifact, and I think all trading card games in general, sort of fall into the region of medium variance and high skill. I think if I had to describe sort of where they aim, so that might be where we might see the game line up in this diagram. So we know that we can have luck in our games, and that this is something that you're sort of allowed to have in them. But what does it actually do? Like, what does it offer to the games? What does it improve? Actually, a lot of things. If you ask Dr. Garfield, once again. So here's some examples. One, it increases variety. So if there are random things happen in your game, you're not seeing the same thing happening every game. Things play out differently. That allows every game to feel different and increases replayability. Next, it protects ego. Losing sucks. Everybody knows this. And when you lose at games that are low variance, it can really hurt because you're just like, yeah, man, I suck. I'm dumb. It makes you feel stupid. If you have some amount of randomness in the game, it actually feels a lot better to blame RNG than it does to blame your own play. And so that's a useful thing to have there. Now, that might be a bit of a barrier for you to get better, but it feels better to play the game. Another is that it broadens the audience. One of the factors that you see in gaming is that you need to be playing against people who have a relatively similar skill level to you in order to actually enjoy the games, because if they're a lot better than you, then they stomp you, and if they're a lot worse than you, then you stomp them. And that, although I enjoy stomping people as much as the next person, it does get boring after a certain period of time. So by introducing some amount of variance into the game, it actually increases the range of people that you can play against, because somebody who's better than you, but not a lot better than you, you can still beat them because you can just run hot, and the game will be competitive, and vice versa as well if you run badly against somebody who's worse than you. Another thing it offers is a catch-up mechanic, as we sort of mentioned earlier in the shop example. This is a way to offer a catch-up mechanic in the game. Also, the Monopoly example clearly is also another usage of RNG to add catch-up to the game. There's also a certain skill to do with randomness. People who are better or worse than playing around random effects and thinking about what are the possible outcomes of a given random effect. So that's something that people will sometimes understate, that just playing around randomness is a skill in and of itself. So how does this play out for Artifact, of course? Well, we already know that there's some amount of randomness in the game. We know that the creeps spawning in random lanes and attacking in different orders or different targets is one element of randomness. The shop is another element of randomness as well. So we should expect to see all sorts of random effects like this, but are sort of lower level ones that are happening within the game to help it keep it fresh and different and establish this. One of the things that I found sort of frustrating going through this was I didn't get a clear sense of where Dr. Garfield's thinking was in terms of where RNG should be in a game. Like what are the correct places for to be randomized, what amount of randomness is good, what amount of randomness is bad. There's a lot of bad examples, obviously, of randomness in card games. Hearthstone has a pretty bad reputation for being too random in a lot of places. But like why is that? Like what would be his thinking as to where you put randomness and why? So this is something I'm really curious about to get thoughts of his maybe at some point in the future, because this is a rich area that has a lot of complexity, and you can imagine being misapplied in various ways. There's, of course, a bunch of links below that are on this news. There's a specific link about the talk that he gave on luck versus skill in gaming, because a lot of this came from one specific talk that's in my resources down there. Now, let's talk about economics, our last major section. So a lot of this stuff came from a collection of different thoughts from his different pieces, but this is one section that is really driven from one piece that he wrote and published on his Facebook page, Dr. Garfield's Facebook page, and it's a piece called Game Player's Manifesto. And another thing is that I would say is that in general he takes a pretty open-ended, open mindset to gaming, and there's a lot of different possibilities that you could see in a game to make the game good. But here is a scenario where he has, I think, fairly strong opinions about what makes a game good versus bad. So I'll just sort of summarize the points in this, but I would encourage you to just read the whole thing because it's quite good. And once again, the links are down below. So the first is that he says is that there are some games that you can describe as Skinnerware, which are games that are designed to addict players and encourage them to constantly spend their time and energy and money to constantly advance in the game. Second, he says, no, not everybody is particularly addictive and susceptible to these Skinnerware style games and Skinnerware style effects, but there are some people who are incredibly susceptible to them, and that's something that you need to be aware of. And these people who have addictive personalities are an important subset of the gaming community. Next, he talks a little bit about whales and what it means to be a whale. Now, I think that a lot of people are used to this idea if you've been involved in online gaming for a while. Whales are described as people who spend a lot of money on the game and really buy all the possible power-ups and options that are available to you, and sort of supercharge their game with the power of the wallet. Now, one of the things that is a pretty common misconception about whales is that most people who are in that category are just extravagantly wealthy and just are throwing their wallet at the game because they can. It's actually not the case, unfortunately. There are a lot of people who are really, they have fixed incomes, they don't have a lot of money to spare, and they've just been hooked so badly by the game that they're just kind of pouring their limited resources into the game, and it ends up to a pretty unhealthy state because they're kind of ruining their lives when they're spending money on the game. So while making money is not wrong in games, like you're allowed to make a profit off of your art and off of your work, whale hunting specifically is wrong. So designing your game to try to hook these whales isn't healthy, because you're doing something morally wrong. But not only is it wrong morally, you're actually just making bad games. There are a lot of examples of games you can find in places like the App Store that have power-ups randomly that you can just purchase that allows you to supercharge even in multiplayer formats, and that doesn't particularly lead to good, compelling gameplay. It actually just leads to imbalanced gameplay. And one of the things that Dr. Garfield specifically says that is a good means to stop this behavior or limit this behavior is to implement spending caps and having some limits to what you can spend in a game in order to the things don't get out of control. One of the things that Dr. Garfield didn't clarify in as much detail is describing sort of where the term Skinnerware comes from. So you see here a picture of B.F. Skinner, who is a psychologist from the mid-20th century. He was really famous for following up on some of the work of Pavlov, focusing on training animals, and a lot of the lessons that he learned actually showed that they could be applied to humans and training humans how to do things, and it was pretty powerful research in the field of psychology, but a lot of this research has been used in both the field of gaming and the field of gambling to figure out better ways to encourage people to play more than they should and do things more than they should. It's a pretty powerful research and can be misapplied fairly often. So once again, there are a bunch of links below that sort of describe some of this stuff in more detail. You can see the link to the manifesto, as well as a couple of additional resources down there. But what does this relate to Artifact once again? Like, how can we expect this? We don't have very many details about the economics of the game. Should we expect Artifact to be a Skinnerware style game? Well, obviously not if Dr. Garfield's working on it. In fact, one of the particular suggestions that he gives is that the spending on games should be capped, and you'll see this in practically any card game, is because you can only buy so much material. There's only so much stuff that you can acquire in the game. It's not like you have endless places to spend money. The one area that you could potentially see in the game that will line up for this is depending on the structure of tournaments and how they organize them in the game. And if you look at Magic the Gathering Online, there is some amount of Skinnerware-isms in their tournament structures that they use. So I'm a little bit worried about that, but not particularly, given the fact that Dr. Garfield is, of course, pretty conscious of this and wants to avoid these unhealthy and immoral uses of gaming. So with that, let's do a few conclusions on our way out the door. The wonderful Richard Garfield has some very compelling thoughts, in my opinion, on the subject of gaming. Very interesting to learn about that, and hopefully you picked up some great lessons from this as to where the game might be going, and give you some ideas of how to think about the things that are coming in the pipeline and what we might be expecting But thank you so much for sticking around and watching. And of course, be sure to like, share, subscribe. This is actually my first video that I've ever done, so I really would love to have the support in that respect. Of course, give feedback and thoughts on the Reddit thread. You can once again find the link for that below, and then check out Artifact Academy, the website that this is associated with it, and where you can find the full article that has all of the details in this. But check out everything. Thank you so much for sticking with me, and hopefully I'll be having another video up for you soon.